Captain Lucas Bryant stood in the observation deck of the horizon's edge and watched the Quillari orbital habitats spin peacefully against the stars. 3 days ago, that same station had been dying. The life support systems were failing and 12 million Quillari citizens were hours away from suffocating in the cold vacuum of space. Lucas and his crew had worked without sleep to repair the cascading failures in the station's primary grid. His chief engineer, Sophie Harris, had identified the problem within an hour of arrival. It was a design flaw that the Quillari engineers had overlooked for decades. The quantum regulators were degrading faster than their automated systems could detect. Sophie had explained it to the Quillari technical team, but their response had been dismissive. They insisted their designs were perfect and that humans were simply misunderstanding their superior technology. Lucas had given Sophie permission to fix it anyway. She bypassed their protests and rebuilt 3 critical junction points while the station's atmosphere grew thinner. When the repairs were complete and the life support system stabilized, the Quillari station master had simply nodded and returned to his duties without a word of thanks. Now Lucas stood before the Galactic Coalition Council chambers waiting to receive what he assumed would be formal recognition for saving 12 million lives. The council chamber was a massive spherical room that floated in the center of the Coalition headquarters station. Representatives from 47 species sat in their designated sections. The Quillari occupied the largest section, draped in their traditional blue and silver banners. The Vexer sat in their elevated military positions, looking down at everyone else with their 4 eyes that never seemed to blink. The Turellians clustered together in their environmental pods that maintained the high humidity their bodies required. Humans had a small section near the back with seating for only 3 representatives. Claire Peterson sat in the center chair, smoothing down her diplomatic uniform. She had been Earth's chief diplomat to the Coalition for 12 years, and Lucas had never seen her look nervous before. Today, her hands trembled slightly as she organized her datapad. The council speaker called the session to order. The speaker was a Vexer named Keth, who had held the position for 30 years. His voice boomed through the chamber's translation systems. The first matter of business was the Quillari incident. Lucas expected a brief acknowledgement followed by discussion of other matters. Instead, the Quillari ambassador rose from his seat. Ambassador Theron was old, even by Quillari standards, with skin that had faded to a pale gray. He activated his holoprojector, and an image of the damaged orbital habitat filled the center of the chamber. Theron began speaking in a tone that made Lucas's stomach tighten. The ambassador accused humanity of unauthorized intervention in Quillari's sovereign territory. He claimed that human engineers had damaged sensitive equipment while performing unnecessary repairs. He stated that the Quillari government had the situation under control, and that human interference had actually delayed their own repair efforts. The hologram shifted to show financial projections. Theron claimed that the human repairs had cost the Quillari government billions in lost productivity and damaged equipment. He formally requested that the Coalition impose sanctions on humanity for this violation of established protocols. Lucas felt his jaw clenched. Claire Peterson stood to respond, but the speaker did not immediately recognize her. Instead, he called upon the Vexer military representative. Commander Zeth stood, and his massive frame cast shadows across the chamber. Zeth spoke about the importance of respecting boundaries and sovereign rights. He mentioned that human ships had been present in 17 different crisis situations over the past year. He suggested that perhaps humans were creating dependency among other species. He used words like interference and overreach. When he finished, several other representatives nodded in agreement. The Turellian ambassador spoke next. She was more measured in her tone, but her message was similar. She thanked humanity for their historical contributions, but suggested that the galaxy needed to grow beyond relying on human solutions. She proposed that humans should take a step back and allow other species to develop their own capabilities. It was phrased as friendly advice, but Lucas heard the underlying message clearly. Claire Peterson finally received recognition to speak. She stood, and her voice carried the weight of 12 years of diplomatic experience. She reminded the council that humanity had joined the Coalition 300 years ago as equals. She listed the contributions humans had made, the medical advances that had saved billions across dozens of species, the engineering solutions that kept ancient stations functioning. the peaceful resolution of conflicts that would have become wars, the agricultural techniques that ended famines. She displayed data showing that in the past century alone, human intervention had prevented 14 major catastrophes and countless minor ones. She asked the council to remember that humans had never asked for payment or special privileges. They had simply helped because it was the right thing to do. The chamber was silent when she finished. Then Ambassador Theron stood again. He said that Claire's speech proved his point. Humans viewed themselves as saviors and other species as helpless. This attitude was harmful to the dignity and growth of the other coalition members. The Vexer representative agreed. Then the Tyrellian. Then species after species stood to voice similar concerns. Some were apologetic in tone, but the message was always the same. Humanity needed to be restricted. The vote came quickly. The council approved sanctions limiting human ships to their own territory. Human representatives would maintain a presence on the council, but only in an advisory capacity, with no voting rights. All human-operated facilities outside of human space were to be transferred to local control within 6 months. The measure passed with 41 votes in favor and only 6 opposed. Earth's vote against the measure didn't matter. Lucas watched Claire's shoulders slump as the final count was displayed. 3 centuries of partnership had just been reduced to advisory status in less than an hour. The message was clear. Humanity was useful, but not equal. They were tools to be used and then put away when no longer needed. Claire turned to look at Lucas. Her eyes asked the question she couldn't voice in this chamber. What do we do now? Lucas stood and walked down to the speaking platform. The speaker seemed surprised, but recognized him. Lucas kept his statement brief. He said that humanity understood the council's decision. He said that humans would respect the boundaries that had been set. Then he said that effective immediately humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Coalition. There would be no appeal and no negotiation. Within 1 standard year, every human presence would be removed from Coalition space. He thanked the Council for 3 centuries of cooperation and wished them well in their future endeavors. The chamber erupted in confused chatter. The speaker tried to call for order. Ambassador Theron looked pleased as if this was exactly what he wanted. Commander Zeth nodded approvingly. Claire stared at Lucas with wide eyes. Lucas simply turned and walked out of the chamber. Sophie Harris was waiting outside in the corridor. She'd been listening to the proceedings through the audio feed. She looked at her captain and asked if he was serious. Lucas told her to send a priority message to Earth Command. Use the old code phrase that had been gathering dust in the archives for decades. The phrase was simply 2 words that would trigger protocols most people had forgotten existed. The phrase was project. Exodus Admiral Helen Griggs received the activation codes for Project Exodus while she was reviewing supply manifests in her office on Earth. She had been part of the team that designed the contingency plan 40 years ago when she was just a junior officer. Back then, it seemed like paranoid preparation for something that would never happen. The plan was simple in concept, but massive in scope. If humanity ever needed to leave Coalition space, they would do so completely and permanently. Every human ship, every station, every colonial outpost would be recalled. Nothing would be left behind except empty facilities and silence. Helen immediately convened the Emergency Command Council. The meeting took place in a secure bunker beneath Geneva, where the old United Earth government still maintained its Crisis Operations Center. Generals and admirals appeared on holoscreens from across human space. The Secretary General asked Helen to confirm that this was really happening. Helen played the recording of Lucas Bryant's statement to the Coalition Council. The room fell silent as they listened to the sanctions being imposed and Lucas's calm declaration of withdrawal. When the recording finished, the Secretary General asked how long they had. Helen said the timeline was 1 year, but she recommended they complete the exodus in 6 months. The faster they moved, the less chance there was for the Coalition to interfere or try to stop them. The order went out on encrypted channels to every human installation. On the trade station Nexus Prime, Station Master Jake Morrison gathered his staff and told them they were going home. Nexus Prime was the largest commercial hub in Coalition space, and humans managed 60% of its trade operations. Jake had spent 15 years building relationships with merchants from 30 different species. His Tyrellian assistant asked if this was temporary. Jake shook his head and ID it was permanent. Within a week, Jake and his team began the process of liquidating assets and closing accounts. The alien merchant seemed confused, but not particularly concerned. A Vexor trader named Corvin actually laughed and said it would be good for local businesses to operate without human competition. Jake didn't bother explaining that humans weren't the competition, but rather the framework that made interspecies trade possible. He simply wished Corvin well and continued packing. The human quarter of Nexus Prime emptied over the following month. Shops closed and warehouses were cleared. The complex inventory management systems that tracked goods across 40 star systems were shut down. Jake left detailed instructions for his replacement, but he knew the Tyrellian administrator wouldn't understand them. The systems weren't just software, but rather networks of relationships and trust that had taken decades to build. On his last day, Jake stood in the empty cargo bay that had once processed millions of tons of goods every week. The lights were dimmed and the massive space echoed with his footsteps. He uploaded one final report to the Coalition Trade Authority and then erased all human records from the station computers. The Coalition had mandated that human contributions be removed from shared databases as culturally biased. Jake was simply following orders. Dr. Nathan Cole worked in the xenobiology research station orbiting Kepler-7. He had spent 20 years studying the unique microbial life that thrived in the planet's methane oceans. His research partner was a Tyrellian scientist named Vesh, who had become a close friend. When Nathan told Vesh about the recall, Vesh assumed it was a temporary political gesture. He said humans would be back within a few months once the council realized their mistake. Nathan didn't correct him. He spent his remaining weeks downloading 3 centuries of human research data. The files filled massive storage drives. Genetic sequences, chemical analyses, behavioral studies, and thousands of breakthrough discoveries that humans had freely shared with the Coalition. The Tyrellians had contributed to this research, but the foundation and methodology were human. Nathan packaged his personal belongings and prepared to leave. Vesh asked if Nathan would leave copies of the research files. Nathan explained that the council had ordered all human data removed. Vesh protested that the research belonged to everyone. Nathan smiled sadly and said that the council should have thought of that before the sanctions. He wiped the main computers and took the only copies with him. Similar scenes played out across Coalition space. Human doctors left hospitals and took their techniques with them. Human teachers departed universities and their curricula went dark. Human technicians who maintained critical infrastructure simply stopped showing up for work. In every case, they offered to train replacements, but few species took them seriously. The general attitude was that humans were being dramatic and would return once they got over their hurt feelings. Only a handful of individuals understood what was really happening. A Quelari engineer named Torin, who had worked alongside. Sophie Harris tried desperately to learn everything she knew before she left. Sophie spent her last week giving Torin a crash course in quantum field dynamics and power distribution theory. Torin was intelligent and dedicated, but Sophie could see the gaps in his fundamental understanding. The Quelari education system had taught him to follow procedures, but not to understand the underlying principles. When Sophie left, Torin begged her to stay just a few more months. Sophie told him she had no choice. Orders were orders. What the Coalition didn't know was that humanity wasn't simply withdrawing to Earth. The secret installation at the edge of known space had been operational for 5 years. Dr. Linda Hayes and her team of physicists had developed JumpGate, technology that made Coalition faster-than-light systems look like ancient combustion engines. The gates could open stable wormholes across thousands of light years. They didn't just move ships faster, but rather bypassed normal space entirely. The technology was revolutionary, and humanity had kept it completely secret. While humans had been serving the Coalition, they had also been preparing for independence. The first gate activated. In orbit around Earth, it connected to a carefully scouted region of space called the Far Side Expanse. The expanse was beyond all known Coalition charts in a zone that Coalition sensors couldn't reach. Scout ships had identified hundreds of habitable worlds and thousands of resource-rich systems. It was a blank canvas waiting for humanity to claim it. Admiral Helen Griggs stood on the bridge of the carrier Liberty and watched the first colony ships enter the gate. The massive vessels disappeared into the shimmering portal and emerged. 30 seconds later, in the far side expanse, 8,000 light-years away, the trip would have taken Coalition ships 2 years. Human ships made it in less than a minute. The exodus proceeded with military precision. Merchant vessels went first, carrying essential supplies and equipment. Then came the colony ships packed with civilians eager to start fresh. Military vessels provided escort and security. Station sections were dismantled and transported through the gates. Within 3 months, half of humanity's presence in Coalition space had vanished. The aliens noticed but assumed humans were consolidating. Around Earth, they didn't realize Earth itself was being partially evacuated. Jake Morrison arrived in the far side expanse and immediately began working on commercial infrastructure for the new colonies. Dr. Nathan Cole set up research facilities on a world with even more interesting biology than Kepler-7. Sophie Harris led engineering teams in building cities and industries from scratch. Every human who came through the gates felt the same thing: freedom. For 3 centuries, they had served others and solved everyone else's problems. Now they could build something for themselves. By month 6, the withdrawal was nearly complete. Only a skeleton crew remained to operate the final gate sequences. The Coalition still sent occasional messages asking when humans would return. Admiral Griggs didn't bother responding. On the final day, she stood in Earth's orbital command center and watched the last human ships depart. The gates around Earth shut down, and their components were collapsed into portable units. New gates opened briefly to pull those units through, and then closed forever. The technology to reopen them from the Coalition side didn't exist. Earth's system fell silent. A few thousand humans remained to maintain basic facilities, but the vibrant hub of activity was gone. In the far side expanse, humanity's new capital was already rising on a world they named Haven. Admiral Griggs sent one final message to the Coalition Council. It was simple and formal. Humanity thanked the Council for 3 centuries of cooperation and wished them success in their future endeavors. All human obligations were fulfilled and all human presence removed as requested. The message ended with a single line that would haunt the Coalition. For years to come, you are now on your own. The first major failure happened 18 months after humanity's departure. Chief Engineer Voroth stood in the control center of Quailari Station 7 and stared at warning indicators that made no sense. The orbital habitat was home to 8 million. Quailari citizens and the environmental systems were showing cascade errors across multiple subsystems. Voroth had been trained by the best Quailar engineers and had observed Sophie Harris during her repairs 2 years ago. He thought he understood the principles. But now, as he looked at the failing systems, he realized he had only watched her work. Without truly comprehending what she was doing, the quantum regulators that Sophie had repaired were degrading again, but this time the pattern was different. Voroth tried to apply the same fixes he had seen Sophie use, but each adjustment seemed to make the problem worse. He called in his entire engineering team, and they worked through the night trying different solutions. The station's atmosphere processors began cycling incorrectly. Oxygen levels dropped in 3 residential sectors. Voroth ordered an evacuation of those sectors while they attempted repairs. The evacuation went smoothly at first, but then the transport systems connecting the sectors failed. The backup power systems that should have activated automatically didn't respond. Voroth checked the logs and discovered that the backup systems relied on a maintenance protocol that humans had implemented decades ago. No one had maintained them after the humans left, because no one knew they existed. Panic spread through the affected sectors as oxygen continued to drop. Voroth made the desperate decision to shut down power to non-essential areas and reroute everything to life support. It worked for about 3 hours, and then the main power grid overloaded from the unbalanced load. The cascade he had been trying to prevent suddenly accelerated beyond control. Vorath gave the order to abandon station. The evacuation ships weren't sufficient for 8 million people. They managed to save 6 million before the life support failed completely. 2 million Quillari citizens died in the cold vacuum of space. The Quillari government declared a period of mourning and launched an investigation. The investigation concluded that human sabotage during their earlier repairs had caused the delayed failure. No one wanted to admit. They simply didn't understand the systems their own ancestors had built with human help. Commander Zeth, of the Vexor Warfleet, faced his own crisis 6 months later. The Vexor had always prided themselves on military superior. HFY and their fleet was the backbone of coalition defense. Zeth commanded a battle group of 30 warships deployed to the border region where pirate activity had increased. The mission was routine patrol, and the jump to the border sector should have been simple. Vexor ships used quantum jump drives that human technicians had maintained for the past century. After the humans left, Vexor engineers assured everyone they could handle the maintenance themselves. The jump calculations were complex and required precise understanding of subspace mechanics. Zeth's navigation officer ran the standard computations and initiated the jump sequence. The fleet entered subspace, and immediately Zeth knew something was wrong. The ship vibrated with frequencies that shouldn't exist in a proper jump. Alarms sounded across all 30 vessels. 3 ships on the outer edge of the formation simply vanished. Sensor data showed they had been torn apart by subspace currents. Zeth ordered an emergency exit from subspace. The remaining 27 ships dropped back into normal space, but they were nowhere near their intended destination. They were lost in an uncharted region with damaged jump drives. It took the fleet for months to limp back to Vexor space at conventional speeds. A journey that should have taken 3 days stretched into a humiliating crawl across the stars. During those 4 months, the pirates they were supposed to stop raided 12 colonies unopposed. When Zeth finally reached home, he was relieved of command and court-martialed for incompetence. He tried to explain that the jump drive failures were due to improper maintenance, but the Vexor High Command refused to accept that their engineers were inadequate. They blamed Zeth for relying on human-designed systems in the first place. On Nexus Prime, the economic collapse was slower, but just as devastating. The Tyrellian administrator Quesh had taken over Jake Morrison's position with confidence. He assumed trade was simply a matter of connecting buyers and sellers. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Goods moved and transactions processed. Then the cracks began to appear. A shipment of medical supplies destined for a plague-stricken colony was accidentally routed to an industrial depot. By the time the error was discovered and corrected, 3,000 people had died from a treatable disease. A critical component for atmosphere processors was listed in the wrong category and sat in a warehouse for 2 months, while 17 stations ran on failing backup systems. Quesh discovered that Jake's inventory management system was far more complex than it appeared. It wasn't just tracking items, but managing relationships between thousands of suppliers and millions of customers across dozens of species. The system had been built on human understanding of logistics and psychology. It anticipated needs and prevented bottlenecks through subtle adjustments that seemed random but were actually carefully calculated. Without human oversight, the system began making errors. Small errors compounded into larger ones. Quesh tried to fix the problems, but each solution created new complications. Trade volume on Nexus Prime dropped by 40% in the first year, and 70% by the second year. Merchants began abandoning the station for other hubs. The once thriving commercial center became a ghost town of empty warehouses, shuttered shops. The Coalition Council convened emergency sessions every month to address the cascading failures. Ambassador Theron stood before his colleagues and insisted that these were temporary difficulties. He claimed the Coalition species simply needed time to adapt to independence from human interference. Other representatives weren't convinced. The Tyrellian ambassador pointed out that 32 major crises had occurred in the 2 years since human departure. In the 300 years before that, there had been only 15 major crises total. The difference was obvious to anyone willing to see it. The Council sent diplomatic messages to Earth requesting assistance. The messages went unanswered. They sent ships to human colonies only to find abandoned facilities with no forwarding information. They searched for any sign of where humanity had gone but found nothing. It was as if 10 billion humans had simply vanished from the universe. Some council members suggested offering an apology and asking humans to return. Ambassador Theron angrily rejected this idea. He insisted that accepting human help again would be admitting weakness and dependency. Meanwhile, new problems emerged that highlighted just how much humans had done behind the scenes. Medical research had stalled because human doctors had been the primary innovators in cross-species treatment. Agricultural output dropped on colony worlds because human agronomists had developed most of the techniques for growing crops in alien soil. Educational systems struggled because human teachers had created the frameworks for sharing knowledge between species with radically different learning styles. Even simple things like translation protocols began failing because humans had been the ones who truly understood the nuances of interspecies communication. In the far-side expanse, humanity was aware of the Coalition's struggles. Admiral Helen Griggs received intelligence reports from automated monitoring stations left at the edge of Coalition space. She read about the Quelari Station disaster and the Vexor fleet losses and the economic collapse of Nexus Prime. Her staff asked if they should offer assistance. Helen remembered standing in the council chambers and hearing species after species declare that humanity was interfering in creating dependency. She remembered the vote that stripped humans of their equal status. She remembered Ambassador Theron's smug face as he accused humans of overstepping. Helen drafted a response to the Coalition's requests for help. The message was simple and polite. Humanity wished the Coalition well, but had chosen a different path. The Terran Federation was focused on building its own future in the far-side expanse. All previous obligations had been fulfilled when humanity withdrew as requested. The message included offers of humanitarian aid, such as food and medicine, but specifically excluded military assistance, engineering support, or any return to the previous relationship. Helen sent the message and then turned her attention back to more important matters. The colony on Haven was thriving, and 3 more worlds were being terraformed. Humanity had work to do, and it didn't involve cleaning up someone else's mess. The Coalition received Helen's message, and the council chamber erupted in argument. Some species wanted to accept the humanitarian aid. Others saw it as an insult. Ambassador Theron declared that the Coalition would solve its own problems without any human charity. The vote was close, but Theron's faction won. The Coalition formally rejected humanity's offer and declared that they would prove their independence. In the following months, the situation grew worse. Systems continued failing. Conflicts that humans would have mediated erupted into violence. Species that had cooperated for centuries began viewing each other with suspicion and blame. The galaxy was learning a hard lesson about the difference between independence and abandonment. They had demanded freedom from human help without understanding that the help had been holding their civilization together. Now they were free, and they were falling apart. The Krell swarm arrived 5 years after humanity's departure, and the Coalition was completely unprepared. The Krell were an insectoid species from beyond the galactic rim that viewed all other life as resources to be consumed. They had attacked Coalition space 3 times in the past 2 centuries, and each time human tactical brilliance had driven them back. Human commanders understood the Krell hive mind tactics and had developed strategies to counter their overwhelming numbers. The defense plans were detailed and comprehensive, but they required coordination and adaptability that the Coalition no longer possessed. The first Krell ships appeared in the outer colonies without warning. They descended on a Tyrellian mining outpost and stripped it clean in less than 6 hours. Every structure was dismantled, every piece of equipment absorbed into the swarm, and every living being was taken for processing. The Coalition military responded with a battle group led by Vexor Commander Ralph. Ralph had studied the old human tactics and believed he understood them. He positioned his ships in the defensive formation that humans had used successfully during the last Krell incursion. The formation required precise timing and communication between vessels. When the Krell attacked, Routh gave the orders exactly as the human playbook specified. The formation fell apart within minutes. The Vexor ships weren't maintaining the correct spacing because their navigation systems lacked the fine control that human-maintained drives provided. The supporting Quillari vessels missed their timing cues because their communications officers didn't understand the subtle signals that human operators had used. The Tyrellian support ships broke formation entirely when they panicked under the Krell's relentless assault. Routh watched his carefully planned defense crumble and then watched the Krell tear his fleet to pieces. He managed to escape with only 4 ships out of 20. The Krell continued advancing into coalition space unopposed. The Council convened in crisis session, and for the first time since humanity's departure, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They needed help, and the only ones who could provide it were gone. Ambassador Theron still argued against contacting humanity, but his voice was drowned out by desperate pleas from representatives whose worlds were in the Krell's path. The Tyrillian ambassador broke down in tears, describing the refugee crisis as millions fled the advancing swarm. The Quillari military liaison admitted that their forces were suffering defeat after defeat. Even the Vexor High Command acknowledged they couldn't stop the Krell without the tactical expertise humans had provided. The Council made a decision that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. They authorized a mission to find humanity and beg for their return. The problem was that no one knew where humanity had gone. Every human facility in Coalition space was abandoned and stripped of useful data. The few clues they had suggested humans had traveled beyond known space, but the direction and distance were mysteries. The Council commissioned a small explorer vessel named the Seeker and assigned it to Captain Vorin, a Tyrellian navigator known for his determination. Vorin's mission was simple in concept, but potentially impossible in execution. Find the humans and bring them back. Vorin spent 3 months following dead ends and false leads. He investigated abandoned human outposts and analyzed the departure vectors of the last human ships. He searched for any technological signature that might indicate where the jump gates had connected. His crew worked tirelessly, but the trail seemed cold. Then Vorin's science officer detected a faint quantum resonance pattern in deep space far beyond Coalition territory. The pattern matched theoretical predictions for stable wormhole technology, but the Coalition had never successfully created such technology. Humans apparently had. Vorin followed the resonance signature across thousands of light years into regions no Coalition ship had ever explored. The journey took 9 months and pushed the Seeker beyond its designed operational range. The crew survived on rationed supplies and made constant repairs to systems that were failing from the extended voyage. Vorin drove them forward with the knowledge that billions of lives depended on their success. Finally, they detected active power signatures in a region the Seeker's database labeled as empty space. As they approached, they found something that took their breath away. A monitoring station hung in the darkness, surrounded by automated defense platforms. The station was clearly human in design, but more advanced than anything in Coalition space. Vorin sent a standard first contact greeting and waited. Lieutenant Paul Sanders was on duty at monitoring station Delta 7 when the Tyrellian ship appeared. The station's purpose was to watch for any Coalition vessels that might stumble into the far-side expanse and to provide early warning of threats. Paul had been stationed there for 2 years, and this was the first time anyone from the Coalition had made it this far. He reviewed the Seeker's profile and saw it was barely holding together. The ship had been pushed far beyond its limits. Paul admired the determination that took, but it didn't change his orders. He opened a communication channel and greeted Captain Vorin professionally. Vorin's message was desperate and honest. He explained the Krell invasion and the Coalition's losses. He described how the defense strategies were failing without human expertise. He talked about the billions of refugees in the colonies that had been destroyed. He begged Paul to contact human leadership and ask them to return. Vorin admitted that the Coalition had been wrong to impose sanctions and wrong to take humanity for granted. He said the Council was prepared to offer a formal apology and restore humanity's full status. He promised that things would be different if humans came back. Paul listened to the entire message without interruption. When Vorin finished, Paul's response was calm and measured. He told Vorin that he appreciated the honesty and understood the desperate situation. He offered to resupply the Seeker for its journey home and provide medical assistance for Vorin's exhausted crew. When Vorin asked about military help, Paul's answer was gentle but firm. The Terran Federation had made a decision 5 years ago to build a new future separate from the Coalition. That decision was final. Paul explained that humanity bore no ill will toward the Coalition, but also had no obligation to rescue them from consequences of their own choices. Vorin tried to argue. He pointed out that innocent civilians were dying. Paul agreed that it was tragic, but noted that humans had no control over the Krell's actions. Vorin said the Council would agree to any terms humanity demanded. Paul replied that humanity wasn't interested in negotiating terms because they weren't interested in returning. Vorin asked what would happen to the Coalition. Paul said that was for the Coalition to determine. The conversation went in circles for an hour, with Vorin growing increasingly desperate and Paul remaining politely unmoved. Finally, Paul offered one concession. He would forward Vorin's message to Terran Federation leadership, but he couldn't promise any response beyond what he had already given. The Seeker remained near the monitoring station for 3 days while Paul's crew helped repair the most critical damage and replenish their supplies. During that time, Vorin tried several more times to convince Paul or any other human to help. He spoke with the station's chief engineer, who had once worked on Nexus Prime. The engineer listened sympathetically, but explained that she was much happier building new things in the far side expanse than fixing broken things in Coalition space. Vorin spoke with a medical officer who had treated Krell attack survivors during the last invasion. The doctor provided medical supplies for Coalition refugees, but refused to return to treat them personally. Every human Vorin encountered was polite and helpful within limits, but absolutely unwilling to go back. On the 4th day, Paul received a response from Terran Federation Command. The message authorized him to share basic information about humanity's new home with Captain Vorin. Paul showed Vorin long-range scans of the Farside expanse. Hundreds of star systems with human colonies and stations. Vast construction projects transforming entire worlds. Ships moving between systems using jump gate technology that made Coalition FTL look primitive. Everything was clean and new and thriving. Paul explained that humanity had spent 5 years building this civilization and had no interest in abandoning it to return to the Coalition's problems. Vorin realized he was looking at the future while the Coalition was collapsing into the past. He asked one final time if there was anything that would convince humans to help. Paul thought about it carefully and then gave an answer that was both honest and painful. He said that 300 years of partnership and friendship hadn't been enough to earn basic respect from the Coalition. 5 years of crisis hadn't taught the Council to value what they had lost. Even now, Vorin was asking humans to sacrifice their new future to save the Coalition's old one. Paul asked what would be different if humans returned. Would they be treated as equals or as convenient servants? Vorin couldn't answer because he knew the truth. The Seeker departed the monitoring station and began the long journey back to Coalition space. Vorin carried supplies and medicine that would help thousands, but not the military salvation that billions needed. He also carried Paul's final message to the Coalition Council. The message was brief and professional. Humanity acknowledged the Coalition's difficulties and wished them success in overcoming their challenges. The Terran Federation would continue to offer humanitarian assistance, but would not provide military intervention or return to the previous relationship. The galaxy had chosen independence, and now independence was what they had. Back in Coalition space, the Krell continued their advance. The Vexor threw everything they had at the invaders and suffered catastrophic losses. The Quillari tried to negotiate with the Krell and discovered that hive minds don't negotiate. The Turellians fortified their core worlds and watched their colonies fall one by one. Internal conflicts erupted as species blamed each other for the disaster. The Vexor accused the Quillari of weakness. The Quillari accused the Vexor of incompetence. Everyone blamed the Turellians for the failed mission to retrieve humanity. Ambassador Theron finally lost his position when his own government demanded a scapegoat. The coalition was learning that freedom came with responsibility, and that independence meant standing on your own. They were failing at both, and there was no one left to save them from themselves. 10 years after humanity's departure, the Galactic Coalition was unrecognizable from its former glory. The Krell swarm controlled a third of what had been Coalition territory. Internal conflicts had shattered the remaining alliances into fragments. Trade routes that had connected dozens of worlds for centuries were now dangerous corridors where pirates operated freely. Billions had died from war, famine, and system failures that no one knew how to repair. The grand vision of species working together in harmony had collapsed into desperate survival. The new Coalition Council met in emergency session in a backup facility on Terrelia Prime. The original council headquarters had been destroyed in a Krell attack 2 years earlier. The chamber was smaller and darker than the old one. Only 23 species remained as active members. The others had either been conquered by the Krell or had withdrawn to protect their own interests. The mood in the chamber was grim and desperate. Ambassador Kelra, a Quellery, who had replaced the disgraced Theron, stood to address the assembly. Her skin was pale with stress, and her voice trembled as she spoke. She formally proposed what many had been thinking but few dared say aloud. The Coalition should send an official delegation to humanity and offer a complete and unconditional apology. The proposal passed with only 2 dissenting votes. Those 2 votes came from the remaining Vexor representatives who still clung to pride even as their civilization crumbled. The council authorized a delegation of senior ambassadors from multiple species. They would carry messages of apology, requests for forgiveness, and desperate pleas for assistance. The delegation would be led by Ambassador Kelra herself. She accepted the responsibility knowing it might be futile, but also knowing they had no other options left. The journey to the far side expanse took a full year. The delegation's ship was old and slow because the Coalition no longer had access to better vessels. They followed the route Captain Voren had documented 5 years earlier. The journey gave Kelra plenty of time to prepare her speech and to reflect on how catastrophically wrong things had gone. She reviewed historical records of human contributions to Coalition society. The medical advances, the engineering solutions, the peaceful negotiations, the countless crises, resolved quietly and efficiently. For 3 centuries, humans had been the glue holding the galaxy together, and the Coalition had never truly appreciated it until the glue was gone. When the delegation finally reached the monitoring station, Lieutenant Paul Sanders was no longer there. He had been promoted and reassigned to Haven's defense fleet. The new officer in charge was Commander Lisa Chen. She received the delegation professionally and listened as Kelra explained their purpose. Lisa verified their credentials and then authorized them to proceed deeper into the Farside expanse under escort. 3 human patrol ships accompanied the delegation vessel to ensure they didn't stray from the approved route. The Coalition ambassadors looked out their viewports and saw human civilization thriving across hundreds of systems. Massive stations orbited pristine worlds. Colony ships moved between gates in an endless flow of expansion. Everything they saw spoke of growth, prosperity, and purpose. They arrived at Haven 10 days later, and the sight took their breath away. The planet was beautiful, with blue oceans and green continents. Cities spread across the surface, connected by gleaming infrastructure. Orbital rings surrounded the world, filled with docks and habitats and manufacturing centers. Ships came and went in organized patterns that showed sophisticated traffic control. This was what humanity had built in just 10 years. The Coalition ambassadors were escorted to a government complex in the capital city and given comfortable quarters. They were told that President Elena Martinez would receive them the following day. That night, Kelra stood on a balcony overlooking the city. Lights stretched to the horizon in every direction. Music and laughter drifted up from the streets below. People walked freely without fear. The air was clean and the atmosphere peaceful. It reminded Kelra of what Coalition worlds had been like before everything fell apart. She realized this wasn't just a functioning society, but a thriving one. Humans hadn't merely survived their separation from the coalition. They had flourished. The next morning, the delegation was brought to the presidential hall. President Elena Martinez received them in a conference room that was professional but not ostentatious. Elena was in her 60s with gray hair and calm eyes. She greeted each ambassador personally and ensured they were comfortable. When everyone was seated, she invited Kelra to speak. Kelra delivered the speech she had prepared and refined during the long journey. She acknowledged every mistake the coalition had made. She admitted that the sanctions had been unjust and that taking humanity for granted had been foolish. She described the suffering that had resulted from humanity's absence. She offered a formal apology on behalf of the coalition and asked if humanity would consider returning. Elena listened without interruption. When Kelra finished, Elena thanked her for the honesty and the apology. She said that she understood the coalition's suffering and felt genuine sympathy for it. Then she explained that the Terran Federation had moved beyond the old relationship. She gestured to displays showing maps of the far side expanse and statistics on human progress. Over 400 colony worlds established, trade networks connecting thousands of systems, scientific research advancing at unprecedented rates, arts and culture flourishing, exploration missions pushing into unknown space. Elena said that humanity had spent 3 centuries serving the coalition and sacrificing their own potential to solve everyone else's problems. The past 10 years had shown what humans could accomplish when they built for themselves instead of others. Kelra tried to argue that the galaxy needed humanity's help. Elena didn't dispute that, but asked a simple question. Why was that humanity's responsibility? Kelra said that the coalition would offer full equality and voting rights. Elena replied that humans had deserved equality from the beginning and shouldn't have to earn basic respect through crisis. Kelra promised the coalition would never take humanity for granted again. Elena said that promises made in desperation rarely lasted once the crisis passed. Kelra asked what would happen to the billions suffering under Krell occupation. Elena's response was compassionate but firm. Those billions were not suffering because humanity left, but because the coalition had failed to value what it had and failed to prepare for what might come. The Vexor ambassador spoke up, and his tone was angry. He accused humanity of abandoning the galaxy out of spite. Elena's expression didn't change, but her voice carried steel when she responded. She reminded him that the coalition had voted to restrict humanity's activities and reduce their status. She noted that the Vexor representative had been among the loudest voices calling humans interfering servants. She said humanity had simply respected the coalition's wishes. The Vexor ambassador tried to argue further, but Kelra silenced him with a sharp gesture. She knew anger would accomplish nothing. Kelra asked if there was any possibility of renewed cooperation. Elena considered the question carefully and then made an offer. The Terran Federation would provide humanitarian assistance to coalition refugees. Food, medicine, and basic supplies would be made available at designated transfer points. Human doctors would treat the wounded at field hospitals established in neutral territory. Human engineers would provide technical documentation for critical systems. But there would be no military intervention against the Krell, no return to the old dynamic of humans solving every coalition problem. No permanent presence in coalition space. The assistance was meant to help the coalition learn to stand on its own, not to restore the dependency relationship. Kelra asked why humanity wouldn't help fight the Krell when human tactics could save billions. Elena's answer cut to the heart of the matter. She said the coalition needed to develop its own capabilities and its own solutions. If humanity returned every time there was a crisis, the coalition would never grow beyond needing rescuers. She acknowledged this meant more suffering in the short term, but believed it was necessary for the coalition's long-term survival. She added that the Krell were a symptom, not the disease. The real problem was that the coalition had built its entire civilization on human competence without developing its own. That fundamental dependency had too. And even if the process was painful, the meeting continued for hours, but Elena's position didn't change. She was sympathetic but resolute. The Terran Federation would help the coalition survive, but not save them from their own mistakes. As the delegation prepared to leave, Alina walked with Kelra to the landing platform. Kelra asked one final question. Did humanity hate the Coalition for what had happened? Alina shook her head. She said humans didn't hate anyone, but they had learned an important lesson about their own worth. For 3 centuries, they had defined themselves by their service to others. Now they were discovering who they could be when they served their own dreams and built their own future. She told Kelra that she hoped the Coalition would find its own strength and create something better from the ruins. The delegation returned to Coalition space carrying supplies and documentation, but not the salvation they had hoped for. Kelra delivered her report to the council, and the chamber fell into bitter argument. Some species wanted to reject the humanitarian aid as insufficient. Others were grateful for any help at all. The Vexor representatives stormed out, declaring they would solve their own problems. The Turellian ambassador began crying from exhaustion and despair. In the end, the council voted to accept humanity's offer because they had no real choice. Over the following years, the Coalition slowly stabilized. The humanitarian aid prevented complete collapse. The technical documentation helped species repair some of their failing systems. More importantly, the crisis forced Coalition members to work together in new ways. Species that had relied on humans to mediate their conflicts had to learn to negotiate directly. Engineers who had depended on human expertise had to study fundamental principles instead of just following procedures. It was difficult and painful, and many more lives were lost. But gradually something new began to emerge from the wreckage. Meanwhile, in the far side, Expanse humanity continued expanding and evolving. Sophie Harris led projects that pushed engineering into realms the Coalition had never imagined. Dr. Nathan Cole discovered life forms that rewrote biological understanding. Admiral Helen Griggs commanded Exploration FL,